Let me show you a number about the 1% that most people get wrong. You've probably heard the top 1% are rich. What you may not know is exactly how concentrated that wealth is. The wealthiest 1% of Americans currently hold half of every share of stock in the country, not half of the money invested by rich people, half of all of it. The top 10% hold 87% of it and control nearly 68% of all the wealth that exists. Everyone else, the remaining 90% of the country, is left splitting the last 13% of that stock. Here's what most people miss about that number. It's not really a story about income. Plenty of people in that bottom 90% earn a good salary. It's a story about management. The 1% are not richer only because more money passes through their hands each month. They are richer because of how that money gets managed once it lands. And that management is what decides how much of it ends up owned instead of spent. This is not about your income. It is about what you do with it once it lands in your account. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how to manage your own paycheck the way the 1% manage theirs, no matter what you make. It comes down to four numbers: 25, 15, 50, 10. This is known as the 25, 15, 50, 10 rule. Here's how they work. For every $100 that lands in your account after tax, $25 is built for growth. $15 is built for stability. $50 covers what keeps your life running today. That's essentials. And $10 is yours to enjoy, guilt-free. That's rewards. Four categories, four different jobs. Growth turns income into something you own. Stability catches you when a bill you didn't see coming shows up. Essentials keep you fed, housed, and functioning. And rewards keep the whole system sustainable, so you don't burn out trying to follow it. One thing before we go further: these numbers are built around your take-home pay, not what you're paid on paper. The money that actually lands in your account after tax, after any mandatory deductions. That's the number you're working from. And here's the part people get wrong immediately. These percentages are a destination, not a test you're failing right now. If your essentials are eating 70% of your income this month, you don't force the math to say 50. You start with what's actually true and you build toward this over time. 50% for essentials is a ceiling to move toward, not permission to spend up to it. If your essentials only need 40%, don't stretch that remaining slice up to 50 just because you technically can. Send it somewhere that builds your future instead. There's one more wrinkle worth flagging here. If you're carrying high interest debt, credit cards, payday loans, or bills that are already overdue, this order shifts for a while. I'll walk you through exactly how once we've covered what each of these four numbers does. With that said, let's begin where every paycheck begins: 50%. Essentials. Section 1, 50% essentials. Essentials aren't everything you spend money on. They're the things that would threaten your housing, your health, your ability to work, or a legal obligation you owe if you stop paying for them. Things like keeping the lights on, food on the table, a roof over your head, medication you need, insurance you're required to carry, getting yourself to work, and the minimum payments on your debt. That's the list. Not the takeout you didn't plan for, the subscription you forgot you had, or the gym membership attached to a card you haven't touched since some vague resolution back in January. None of those things are foolish to want. Please don't hear this as an accusation. The issue isn't that you enjoy convenience or comfort. The issue is calling something essential when it's actually a preference, because that's how a life quietly grows more expensive without anyone deciding it should. Quick gut check whenever you're unsure. Does skipping this put your housing, health, job, or legal obligation at risk? If not, it might still be worth keeping. It just doesn't belong in this 50%. Now, most people try to fix their spending by trimming small stuff first, and that's exactly backwards. Cutting one large expense usually beats eliminating a dozen small pleasures. So let's go where the actual money is, starting with the biggest one most people carry: housing. If your lease is coming up for renewal, ask whether the rent can be frozen before you sign anything new. Landlords generally hate losing a tenant more than they hate a slightly awkward conversation, since an empty unit costs them far more than a small discount does. If staying put isn't working, there are other options worth a look. A spare room rented out, a roommate splitting the bill, or a slightly smaller place. None of this is a universal instruction. It's a menu. Use what fits. Right behind housing is transportation. And here's the trap. The payment on a car is only the beginning of what it actually costs you. Add up the insurance, the fuel, the maintenance, the repairs, parking, registration, and depreciation, quietly eating the value of the thing while you're still paying it off. A car that looked affordable at the point of the monthly payment can turn out to be one of the most expensive things you own. The fix isn't complicated. Buy reliable and used instead of new. Keep a working car longer instead of upgrading out of boredom. And use public transport where it's reliable. None of that is a moral stance. It's just where the math tends to be kindest. After housing and transportation, the last place worth checking is your statements themselves. Every recurring charge, every subscription, and every membership you're paying for on autopilot. Some of it's worth keeping. Some of it has been running quietly in the background for so long that you forgot to ask whether you still wanted it. And left unchecked, that adds up to more than people expect. A pile of small recurring charges landing around $175 a month doesn't feel dangerous while it's happening, but that's $2,100 a year, and over 10 years, $21,000. Put that same amount into growth instead, and over 30 years, it grows to somewhere around $400,000. That's not a small leap. That's a decision wearing the costume of a routine. Watch how that plays out in two actual lives. Chris and Priya work the same job at the same company for the same pay. Chris has a car that turns heads in the parking lot and a watch that gets compliments in meetings. Priya drives something a few years old and wears the same 3 sweaters in rotation through most of the winter. On the surface, it isn't close. Chris looks like the one who's doing well, but here's what the surface doesn't show you. Chris has about $40 sitting in his checking account and 2 credit card payments that are already late this month. Priya has a solid cushion of savings already built and a growing account of investments steadily compounding in the background. Wealth, most of the time, is not what you can see. It's what you can't. None of this is about judging Chris. Plenty of people would rather look like him than like Priya. The issue was never that he enjoys nice things. The issue is that his 50% quietly became 80 without him ever agreeing to that trade. So how do you keep this in check, especially standing in a store or staring at a checkout screen? Use 3 quick questions instead of relying on willpower, since willpower runs out exactly when you're exhausted, on edge, or bored. First, is this an impulse? If it's something that's genuinely been on your radar a while and it fits your essentials, there's often no problem. If it is an impulse, sit on it for a week. Usually the pull fades and it mattered far less than it felt like in the moment. Second, if it's still calling to you, is it the brand you want or the actual value? A brand name isn't automatically wrong, but paying extra for a logo and clever marketing is worth noticing. Value isn't the same as cheap either. A pair of boots at $210, worn 140 times, costs about $1.50 a wear. A cheaper pair at $70, worn 7 times before it's abandoned, costs $10 a wear. The expensive one isn't the problem, the unused one is. Third, will it meaningfully improve your life? If yes, that's an intentional purchase and it's allowed. If not, it's probably about boredom or impressing someone. Not worth the money. It's about being intentional, not accidental. But even a completely disciplined essentials budget can be wiped out by one bill nobody saw coming. That's exactly where the next 15% earns its place. Section 2. 15% stability. Malik's whole job depended on his car starting every morning. No car, no job. He didn't have anything saved when the transmission gave out on him, so he did what a lot of people do in that exact moment. He borrowed to fix it. That loan came with its own payment stacked directly on top of everything he was already paying. One mechanical failure didn't just cost him the repair, it cost him an entire year of financial progress because there was nothing behind him to absorb the hit. Most people aren't short on money. They're short on margin. And that is exactly what this 15% stability is built to give you. One unplanned expense arrives, and there's nothing behind them to absorb it. So it turns into debt instead of staying a minor inconvenience. Building that stability happens in steps, and I want to walk through them in order. Step one is a starter buffer. Before you try to save several months of expenses, get a small amount somewhere easy to reach, enough to cover a minor repair or an urgent bill without reaching for a credit card. Step two is calculating the real target. Add up 1 month of your genuine essential expenses. Nothing discretionary. A common target is to multiply that total by 3 months if your income is steady and there's a second income in your household to lean on. 6 months if that's the more typical case, or 12 months if you're self-employed, single income, or in a less stable job. Say your essentials come to $1,500 a month. For most people, 6 months is the right target. So multiply that by 6 and your target is $9,000. Step 3 is where you keep it. And there are 3 things it needs to be. It needs to be reachable quickly, generally within a day, because an emergency that takes weeks to access isn't protecting you. It needs to sit somewhere that isn't exposed to whatever the stock market happens to be doing that week, because the point of this money is that it's there exactly when everything else feels uncertain, and it should still earn something while it waits, rather than sitting in an account paying you nothing while inflation quietly erodes it. An FDIC insured high yield savings account is usually the right home for it. Step 4 is automating that 15% of your paycheck. It moves the second your paycheck lands, before it has the chance to get absorbed into ordinary spending. Roundups and cashback can help you get there a little faster too, but treat them as a bonus on top of the scheduled transfer, not a replacement for it. Step 5 is using it without guilt when the moment comes and knowing what to do once it's full. If you dip into it, the next few paychecks prioritize rebuilding what you spent so it's ready again next time. And once it's genuinely complete, don't keep piling cash into it past the point where it's doing anything for you. Maintain it, replenish it after use, and redirect anything extra toward debt payoff, a home deposit, or investing. At that point, some of what used to be your 15% for stability can shift over and join your growth number instead. That can move from 25% up toward 30 or even 40, depending on where you are. Stability's whole job is stopping you from sliding backward. The next 25% growth is what moves you forward, and that's where every dollar of it should end up doing real work for you. Section 3, 25% growth. This is the part of your paycheck that should still exist in some form years from now. Not spent, not sitting in cash doing nothing, actually working in the background, whether or not you're paying attention to it that day. Let me show you exactly what that looks like over time. Simone started investing $250 a month at 20 years old. Derek held off until his 30th birthday. So to try to close the gap, he put in $400 a month instead. Both of them kept going until they turned 60, then stopped. Added up, and Derek actually contributed more in total, $144,000 compared to Simone's $120,000, $24,000 more out of his own pocket. But run the same numbers at a typical long-run yearly return of 10% for a broad stock index, and here's where they land. Derek's money grows to about $904,000, genuinely solid. Simone's grows to about $1,581,000. She put in $24,000 less and ended up with about $676,000 more purely because of when she started. That's not luck. That's time doing what time does to money that's actually invested instead of just saved. And I want to be honest about the other side of that example too. That 10% return is a long-run historical average, not a guarantee for any single year. Markets go up and markets go down, sometimes for years at a stretch. The lesson here isn't the exact number, it's that starting small and starting early tends to beat waiting to start big. This is the actual mechanism behind those numbers from the start of this video. The one about the wealthiest 1% holding half the country's stock market and the top 10% controlling nearly 68% of all the wealth that exists. It was never that they earn more each month than everyone else. It's that more of what they earn ends up sitting in something like this, compounding quietly for decades across stocks, real estate, and businesses, while most people's money gets spent the same month it lands. So, where does this 25% of your paycheck go? There are two lanes worth understanding, and they work differently. The first lane is financial assets. This usually starts with a tax advantage account, something like a 401k through your employer, or an individual retirement account you open yourself, traditional or Roth. I won't hand you specific contribution limits here, since those numbers shift most years, but the general shape tends to hold. Some accounts let you contribute before tax. Some let your money grow untaxed along the way. Some let you withdraw it later completely tax-free. When an employer matches contributions to a 401k, that match is effectively part of your compensation. And capturing all of it's usually one of the easiest wins available to you. One mistake trips up a lot of beginners. Opening the account and funding it isn't the same as investing it. Plenty of people transfer money into a retirement or brokerage account every month, then leave it sitting there in cash, earning close to nothing because they never actually selected anything to invest in. The account is just a container. You still have to choose what goes inside it. For most people starting out, a reasonable foundation leans toward broad, low-cost, long-term holdings, a fund that tracks a wide stock market index, some exposure to bonds for balance. Real estate is worth understanding too, whether that means owning property directly or pooling money with other investors through a fund that gives you a stake in buildings you'd never be able to afford on your own. I won't build you a specific portfolio in this video because that depends on your age, your goals, and your comfort with risk. But that's the general shape worth researching further. The second lane is earning assets, and it's easy to overlook this one because it doesn't come with a chart you can watch. A skill that people are willing to pay for, sales, a trade, coding, design, clear communication, can produce a return that financial assets often can't match. And nobody can repossess it from you the way they can a stock or a property. The same goes for a small business or the tools and systems that let one grow. The test here isn't whether it sounds impressive. It's whether there's real demand for it and whether you can see evidence that someone will actually pay for what you're building. Worth being careful here too. Different assets carry genuinely different kinds of risk, and they don't line up on one simple scale from safe to risky. A diversified fund can lose value when markets fall. A rental property can sit empty for months. A business can fail outright. Cryptocurrency, individual stocks you're picking without much research, or collectibles chasing a trend can lose most of their value overnight. None of that's inherently wrong, but speculative assets shouldn't form your foundation and should never be money you need for your stability fund or your essentials. Treat it as an amount you could genuinely afford to lose. And don't confuse something being popular with it being safe. Whatever you choose, automate the contribution the same way you did with stability. It moves the day you're paid, gets invested according to your plan, and then you leave it alone. You're not trying to catch the next headline or time some perfect entry point. Consistency is what compounds. Constant tinkering usually just works against you. And here's the loop that ties this whole category together. You build a skill. The skill raises your income. You let your lifestyle rise more slowly than that income does. The difference gets redirected here into ownership. That ownership keeps compounding in the background, and then you do it again. But save, invest, and restrain forever, and something in the system eventually gives. That's where the last 10% comes in. Section 4, 10% rewards. Money was never only about emergencies and retirement. A system that only asks you to save and never lets you actually live starts to feel less like a plan and more like a sentence, and eventually most people just quit on it. That's what this 10% of your paycheck is for, not an afterthought. A structural piece doing a real job. The simplest way to protect it is to give it its own account, separate from everything else, something you might think of as your yes account. On payday, 10% or whatever you can genuinely afford right now moves into it automatically. Inside that account, you spend without guilt because it was already accounted for before you touched it. If it runs out before the month does, that's fine. You wait. You don't refill it from stability or from growth because the moment you do, it stops meaning anything. The question worth asking here isn't whether something is cheap. It's whether the value it adds is worth what it costs you. A small, regular pleasure you genuinely enjoy can be worth more than an expensive purchase you forget about within a week. Nadia spent years treating rest like something she'd get to eventually, once the business was further along, once the goals were further along. Her body eventually sent the bill for that anyway, through stress that landed on her physically. Hard enough that a doctor told her plainly to take an actual break. The trip she finally took wasn't a luxury she felt guilty about afterward. It was the first time in years she came back sharper instead of more depleted. She didn't stop working hard. She just stopped treating rest as something she had to earn permission for. This category covers more than trips too. A hobby that has nothing to do with income, dinners and evenings that keep your relationships actually alive and not just maintained in the background, and gifts for people who matter to you that are rarely about the item itself and much more about what it says you noticed and remembered. You do not have to fund all of them every month. They just need to fit inside the same 10%. Once all four of these numbers are working together, here's the part that changes everything. Let's look at how the rule moves as you grow. Think of this less as a fixed budget and more as 3 stages, each with a different job. In the first stage, you might be financially exposed. Essentials are eating well past 50%. There's debt with real interest attached, credit cards, payday loans, and bills that are already overdue. There's no cushion behind you at all. Remember that wrinkle I flagged earlier? The one where I said this order shifts for a while if that's you? Now that we've covered what each of these 4 numbers does, here's exactly how it shifts in sequence. The first priority is covering your essential expenses in full, not 50% of them, all of them. You can't build anything on top of a life that isn't functioning. The second priority is making the minimum payments on every debt you owe, so nothing falls into default. The third priority is building a small starter buffer, a smaller, faster version of the stability fund we already walked through. Just enough, a few $100s, to stop a flat tire from becoming a new credit card balance. The fourth priority, when there's a retirement match sitting on the table from an employer, is capturing it. That's money that's already yours the moment it's offered. Walking away from it is walking away from part of your pay. The fifth priority is attacking the high interest debt itself as aggressively as you can once the buffer and the match are in place. Only after that debt is gone do you move to building out the full stability fund, and only after that do you bring your investing up toward the full 25%. I know this sounds like it delays the exciting part. It doesn't. Paying off debt that charges you interest every month is a return guaranteed that almost no market can beat. If you're carrying expensive debt, that debt is your first growth investment. You're not stepping away from building wealth. You're fixing the leak before you pour in more water. In the second stage, you're financially stable. Essentials are gradually moving down toward that 50% target. The stability fund is growing. Debt is under control instead of controlling you. Investing is happening consistently, even if it's modest. In the third stage, you're accelerating. The stability fund is complete. There's no expensive consumer debt left. Core expenses are steady and income keeps climbing. This is where the rule gets to flex. The 15% that used to build your stability fund can now mostly redirect into growth, since the fund is already doing its job just sitting there. Growth can move from 25% up to 30 or 40 or higher, depending on your life. Here's the part that trips people up the most, though. A raise doesn't automatically mean every category grows with it. Say your income goes up by 8%. That's 8% more landing in your account every month. But your rent doesn't need to follow it. Neither does your car, your subscriptions, or the 10% you spend on rewards. That extra room is exactly what should accelerate everything else. invest in, debt pay off, a deposit on a home, or whatever the next real goal is. And if you ever spend less than a category allows, 45% on essentials instead of the full 50, say, or 7% on rewards instead of 10, don't let that gap disappear into nothing. Redirect it somewhere on purpose. The whole point of this system isn't holding growth at exactly 25% forever. It's reaching the point where a growing share of everything you earn is building your future instead of just maintaining your present. And that's when this stops being a budget and starts being how you manage money. Let's bring this back to where we started. The wealthiest 1% hold half of every share of stock in this country, and the top 10% control nearly 68% of all the wealth that exists. Not because more money passes through their hands each month than yours, because of how that money gets managed once it lands and how much of it turns into something owned instead of something spent. 50% keeps your life running today. 15% protects everything you've already built. 25% turns income into ownership. 10% keeps the whole thing sustainable enough that you'll stick with it. If you're carrying expensive debt right now, the order shifts for a while, and that's fine. These numbers were always a destination, not a rule book you're failing to follow correctly. The real question was never simply the size of your paycheck. It's what that paycheck leaves behind once it's gone. Whether it left you owning more than you did last month, owing less, and depending a little less on the one that's coming next. That's how you actually manage your money like the 1%. Not by earning like them tomorrow, by managing like them starting with the very next paycheck that lands in your account. If this was useful, subscribe for more like it.